Simon Reddy, thank you very much for agreeing to an interview for my book. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
I wanted to start by asking you about the Global Oceans Commission. Commission.
Ocean,
yeah. With a
I'll explain that.
Please do. Of which you were executive director.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I should just rewind a little bit to say that prior to the commission I worked on cities, but prior to that I actually worked on a lot of ocean issues. I'm a marine biologist by qualification. Marine and fisheries biology was my master's degree. And when I was a political director for Greenpeace, way back in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, I used to attend a lot of the oceans meetings at the UN, which were all these kind of like weird and wonderful sort of subcommittees of subcommittees. And that's actually part of the reason why the Global Ocean Commission was created. And that is that what you found is that the ocean issues basically played second fiddle. It was a cross-cutting issue in the UN. There's no ocean department as such. There's a law of the sea department, but that deals with legality. But there is no ocean department. And a lot of oceans issues were considered cross-cutting. So they cut across food, they cut across agriculture, etc., etc. And there was no sort of like standalone oceans focus. And this meant that the oceans issues didn't get a lot of attention. And part of the whole rationale behind the Global Ocean Commission was to elevate the issue. So when I went back to work on oceans on the ocean in 2012, to help set up the Global Ocean Commission, one of the key sort of remits was to get the ocean issue out of the weeds. In other words, to elevate it. So it was all about giving it public and political, more importantly, political recognition, getting it, as they say, to the top table politically. And that was the whole sort of rationale for the Commission, which I'll then come on to. The Commission's primary focus was the high seas, because we felt that if we started dealing with countries' EEZs, exclusive economic zones, then the response would be, well, who are you? You weren't created by the UN, you weren't sort of like created by any country. But because we formally focused on the high seas, which belongs to everybody and nobody, then arguably we had as much right as anybody else to look at what was happening on the high seas. Having said that, we felt that clearly the only difference between the high seas and the EEZ, technically speaking, is a legal line at 200 nautical miles. And a lot of what happens in the EEZ is relevant to the high seas and vice versa. And that's also part of the reason why we called ourselves the Global Ocean Singular Commission. There may well be 7 seas, but there is one ocean. It's all interconnected. What happens in one part can potentially have an effect in another, because you have ocean currents. And there's a very interesting story around that. I'll maybe come on to that later. But anyway, so that was the key focus, was to elevate the issue. So I was the first person brought in. The commission was an initiative of the Pew Charitable Trusts based in the US, and they got on board another foundation called Oceans 5 and another foundation called Odessium, and they, between the three of them, funded the commission. We subsequently got another foundation, which was Swire Trust, based in Hong Kong, to support as well. And then we got 2.5 years worth of funding, and then we got more funding to carry it on, which I'll come on to. So when I started, there were no other employees. It was based at Somerville College, Oxford, so I was an employee of Somerville College, Oxford, as were all of the other employees. This was to give the Commission independence. Although Pew were the funders, the decisions as to how we operated and what the Commission came out with were my decisions and that of the co-chairs, which we then appointed to the Commission. In terms of who made up the Commission, early on we had lists and lists of possible, we dug into all these people's pasts to see who might have skeletons in their closets and things like that. And we had lists, big lists, small lists. But eventually, David Miliband was involved early on with Pew, mainly as a result of a relationship he built up from the designation of Chagos. And so we used David to get on board Jose Maria Figueres, former president of Costa Rica. We got him and David to get Trevor Manuel on, former finance minister of South Africa. And then we got the three of them to get all the others to some extent, with a few exceptions of Robert Hill, Fua Tulua and Yuika Kawaguchi, who I wrote to and persuaded them to come on board. We didn't bring scientists on board because we felt we had enough science. The science was all out there. This was about politics. This was about raising the issue, giving it political profile, and using some of those commissioners' little black books of contact to be able to push as much as possible. Now, maybe
what happened next?
What happened next? Am I doing okay?
Yes, it's brilliant. And what did the Commission find? And what were its recommendations?
So after a lot of deliberation, and I should say a lot of our commissioners wanted to work quite fast. They didn't want a commissioner. We had some very high-level commissioners, I should say. I mean, we had former presidents, former prime ministers. We had John Podesta, who was at the time in between jobs. He left the commission early to go to the White House to advise Obama, which I'll give you an example of how influential that can be. We had former finance minister of Chile, Andres Velasco. We had Yuika Kawaguchi, former foreign secretary of Japan. I mean, it was really a very high-level group. But you can't keep a group like that together for a long period of time. So we had to work quite fast. We launched the commission. So I started in March 2012. We launched the commission. Well, I had to recruit all the staff. So Christian, Richard Black, everybody was brought on board. All had to advertise, conduct interviews, etc., etc. So we really, and then we launched by February 2013, and we had our first ever commission meeting in Cape Town in March 2013. We had Sri Mulyani from the World Bank on, former finance minister for Indonesia. And we had we always recognised, we had 17 commissioners in total, and we always recognised that at least 4 or 5 of them wouldn't make each meeting. So we wanted at least 12, which is why we went for the number 17. It wasn't a random number. We thought, well, we need at least 10 or 12 on each meeting. Let's accept that 5 drop off, so let's settle for 12. Now, we ended up with 3 co-chairs, more by accident than by design. It wasn't the best of ideas. But no one wanted to take overall responsibility because of the workloads that we all had. So we ended up with 3 co-chairs, and we kind of worked it. And it worked, I mean, it did work very well. And it was very, very different perspectives. So you had David with a very intellectual perspective, Jose Maria with a more sort of, Jose Maria is a very passionate environmentalist, very spiritual, and then Trevor very much brought in the developing world angle, which I thought was crucially important in some of our deliberations. We had 4 meetings in the course of 1 year. So March 2013, July 2013, November 2013, and then again in March 2014. And then we released the report in June 2014. We tried to reach out to as many organisations as possible to get them to input. We had what was known as the POPs papers, the policy options papers. So we ended up with 8 key proposals, but before that we had far more than that. We probably had getting on for about 80.
Really?
We had these policy options papers on key areas, and we asked people to write in and say what they thought of them, and then they went before the commissioners for final agreement. In terms of what we tried to do, and this was a great graphic that the commissioners, actually it was the co-chairs that came up with it. I think it might have been David and Jose Maria, and that was the V diagram. So we first of all identified what the drivers of decline were. Key drivers of decline, as you can see in the report, were technological sort of expertise. The fact that we've moved from a state of the high seas being naturally a marine reserve because you couldn't access it. Technology meant that it was access all areas. Obviously demand for resource. So the key drivers were demand for the resource, access all areas. Overfishing was a consequence of the first 2, but also in itself a driver of decline. And then there was obviously some of the other issues going on in relation to climate change, but also the other big elephant in the room was the governance issue. And we identified within the UN sort of multiple departments all with some sort of stake in ocean affairs, but nobody with overall coordination or responsibility, which is always a recipe for disaster. I think later, we call it the spaghetti soup of governance, but later on I think there was a line, it was something on the lines of there's 350 separate organisations, entities and agreements on the ocean, and not one of them has overall responsibility to coordinate and strategise a way forward. So that kind of summed it up. And then out of that, we then came up with what we thought were the interventions needed to reverse that decline. So the general acceptance of the science is that oceans are in a very, very steep decline. We accepted that climate change was the biggest threat to the ocean in terms of warming and acidification. However, that issue was being dealt with by the UNFCCC. So what we wanted to do was to highlight some of the other drivers. So in other words, if the ocean, in the same way as that if the planet is able to survive climate change, it needs to be as healthy as possible. If you've already got a sick patient, if they then catch another illness, they're more susceptible to sort of fatality. If you make them as healthy as possible, they're going to be more resilient. So that was very much the sort of view that we took. So in terms of interventions, number one, we supported the SDG on the ocean from a very early stage. And in fact, we had David Miliband, Jose Maria and Trevor directly go to the UN and do speeches in support, working with Palau at the time, organising big events at the UN in support of the SDG. I mean, the SDG is not legally binding, but importantly, we felt was that if you have a standalone SDG, which you've never had before, ocean's always been a cross-cutting issue, which is part of the problem within the UN, which is why it's not paid enough attention. If you give it a standalone SDG, then you're giving it a platform, you're giving it a profile, and you're saying both publicly and politically that it's important enough to have a standalone address, so to speak. So that's the main reason why we supported the SDG. We recognised that governance around the high seas was woefully inadequate. So, for instance, I mean, I always think of this in terms of, UNCLOS was initiated in the 60s, it was negotiated in the 70s, and it was signed, it was agreed in the 80s, came into force in the 90s. So when you consider when it was being negotiated 40 years ago. And in those days, we felt that, everyone thought that the deep sea was this dead zone with nothing there. And the idea that you have these ocean currents that go from the bottom of the planet to the top of the planet, was fantasy, basically. So, when you, what was it? I think Thatcher described, this was David's line, Thatcher described the UNCLOS as a constitution for the ocean.
Really?
Well, if we're going to look at it from a political perspective, constitutions need to evolve, otherwise they become irrelevant. So we were very much of the view that UNCLOS needs to evolve, take into account of the latest science, the latest technology, the latest advances. It was focused, UNCLOS was focused on the EEZ more than anything else, because that was the area that people were arguing about. They weren't arguing about the high seas. Now they're starting to argue about the high seas, and the high seas is accessible, and there are resources there. The other, I think, area that we also identified early on was that, as David again rightly put, there were billions of people wanting to be middle class. You can't just close off the high seas to resource extraction, but we need to move away from sort of inefficient, ineffective and unsustainable management towards effective, efficient and sustainable management. That's what we kind of said the Commission was very much about. So we supported the new implementing agreement under UNCLOS. That was another key component of the Commission, which again, we now have, that was way back in 2014, and again in 2015 as with the SDG, and actually at the beginning of 2015, it was agreed that they would move towards a new implementing agreement. So far there's just sort of pre-meetings before the final thing. I'm not sure whether that might change now with some changes in geopolitics, but hopefully I think that has passed now and we will move, though it will be a 10-year negotiating process. And that is very much about looking at the fact that we, at the moment you cannot, if you think about international law, at the moment, the things you can do are only as good as the framework legal sort of framework that they sit upon. And at the moment, you can't even create a marine reserve on the high seas. It's legally, you can't do it legally. So all of these things needed to be looked at, basically. Third thing was we focused on overfishing. The thing we identified as the biggest problem was subsidies. One of our commissioners was Pascal Lamy, former head of the WTO. So he provided us a lot of information and a lot of advice regarding fisheries subsidies, the sort of elephant in the room on fisheries subsidies. The reality is that high seas fishing would not be economically viable if it wasn't for the fact that fuel subsidies. You simply wouldn't, the European fleets wouldn't go to the other end of the world to fish other people's fish stocks if it wasn't for the fact that someone was paying for their fuel, or they weren't paying the full price of the fuel. And the same for the Chinese and the Taiwanese boats as well.
Yes, indeed,
So subsidies, mainly fuel subsidies. And also, if you look at some of the most destructive fishing practices as well, bottom trawling, beam trawling, they're very fuel intensive because you're dragging something very heavy along the seabed. So again, without subsidies, you probably find, I think there's probably a direct correlation between fuel subsidies and destructive fishing practices, as well as being able to fish all areas. That was the third area. Fourth area was IUU, big push on IUU. Illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. It's a very grey area because not all IUU fishing is actually illegal. It is just simply unreported and unregulated. But obviously we focused very heavily on the failure of the RFMOs. RFMOs are a major problem, which links back to point 2 about government.
The regional
fisheries management organisations. They simply don't do their job in many cases. Some are good, but having some of them good is not enough. They all need to be working to the same standards. We made a very clear proposal there, and that is if you manage the oceans only from a fisheries perspective, then you're already on a hiding to nothing. And we should be managing our oceans from a wider systems perspective. So we actually propose that RFMOs are actually given more resources, but they transition to being regional oceans management organisations. In other words, their remit is not simply to look at fisheries, but is actually to manage the ocean. And that means, yes, it means resource management, but it also means conservation management as well. And that basically that should be a key proposal. We wanted to highlight waste that goes into the ocean. Now, we highlighted plastics, and we did a lot of work with a lot of people on plastics, which has been very successful. I think ocean plastics has really come up the agenda, not just because of us, other people working on it as well, but I like to think the Commission was able to elevate the issue as well, certainly with some of the partnerships that we created with ISU, for instance. However, part of our rationale for highlighting plastics wasn't just plastics. It was actually all of the inputs that go into our rivers that can't be seen in many cases, so persistent organic pollutants that are poured into our rivers on a daily basis, but in many cases they're liquid and so people can't see them. Can I say the great thing about plastics, apart from the fact that they are polluting our ocean, is that at least they are visible. I know that they break up into microplastics and eventually disappear, but certainly they are a good way, I think, to communicate to the public that what goes into our rivers and streams ends up in our ocean. But then people will need to realise is that when they walk along a beach and they see the appalling levels of plastic pollution, they should also consider some of the other inputs that are being put in there as well, which are equally as bad. A good example for that would be, I think it was only last week, there was some information where they'd surveyed some deep sea shrimp in was it the Marianas Trench or something, and they'd found organochlorides and persistent organic pollutants. Some of the things that were banned in the 1970s are now being found in deep sea trenches. And I think that's a good example of what goes into our ocean. That was 5, that was plastics. Number 6 was we focused on, what was it?
Protected areas?
Protected areas,
yeah. They were in there, weren't they?
Protected. But before we got onto protected areas, so what we closed for so before we got into protected areas, we said that there needs to also be we came up with this idea after the economic crash in 2008. Paul Martin, who was the then Prime Minister of Canada, who ended up being on our commission, he was responsible for setting up the FSA, which was this sort of international body that oversaw countries' performance in banking and provided an independent sort of like overview on how those banking sector in certain countries, how it could stand up, stress testing and things like that. So he had exactly the same idea with oceans, that we need to set up a global ocean accountability board, which would be an independent body that basically monitored ocean sort of health and which countries were or were not acting responsibly. We also identified oil and gas activity. One of the key concerns is that as oil and gas technology means that we can go deeper looking for new resources. Already we have a slight problem in that offshore oil and gas activity within an exclusive economic zone is regulated by the environmental regulations of that country. And from country to country, it varies wildly. So we argued that there should be a universal minimum standard for operating in our oceans. But as we then move further offshore, when we get outside of the EZ into the international area, again, you need minimum standards and you need liability. So who's liable if there is an oil spill in the international area and it flows into people's EZs and onto other people's coastlines? At the moment, it's a very grey area. And finally, we said that if all of those things could be addressed within 5 years, then we should look at closing the high seas to access, especially to fishing, in order to safeguard the high seas until some of these key problems were or were not addressed.
And is that in the form of marine protected areas or a broader sort of...
It was a broader closure.
It
was a broader closure to high seas fishing. And we worked a lot with McKinsey on some of these aspects. And what's interesting as well, this is in the report, but there was some modelling done that showed that if you close the high seas to fishing, I think you increased profitability within your EZ by 30%. You increased your ability to manage it by 150%. It was a win-win-win. Because the science or the general consensus years ago was that 90% of our fisheries was caught within the EZ and only 10% on the high seas. Well, actually, only about 2% are caught exclusively on the high seas. Something like 42% are caught both within the EZ and on the high seas. So if you are a country who have got extremely well-managed fishery, but just outside your exclusive economic zone, you've got a load of vessels that are fishing. One, they're going to be taking fish that you could have caught within your EZ. And two, they're going to be, if they're unreported and unregulated, they might not be illegal, but if they're unreported and they're unregulated, then you haven't got a cat and house chance of actually managing your fishery, because you don't know what's coming out. Because the fish are basically circling, across your EZ. So if you don't know what's being taken out on the high seas, how are you expected to manage what you've got within the EZ? So it undermines the whole management basis as well. And again, this is where the legality or the way in which we internationally manage our oceans hasn't kept up with the science.
You mentioned that his administration took on one particular recommendation from the GOC. Could you describe that and how it came about, what the link was?
So, I'd never like to crow about what the Commission has done. This actually came from one of our funders who said this, not us. And he said, you do realise that Podesta, because basically John Podesta was on the Commission, he only came to 2 meetings. He joined sort of like spring 2013 and he was off by autumn 2013. So he was off the commission before the commission reported. But he came to the meetings in New York and the meetings in Oxford. He was replaced by Carol Browner. He then went to be chief counsel to the president. And within 6 months, well, I should mention that before coming on the commission, John Podesta knew nothing about the oceans. And there was a great session, which unfortunately you can't report on because it's always in a closed. There was a great session in Long Island in the summer where Robert Hill, who has a history of working with island states, was saying that we can get an SDG on the ocean. And John Podesta was saying, no way will you get an SDG on the ocean, because he just worked on the Millennium Goals for the UN, and he said, and there hadn't been anything on the ocean, and he said, there's no way you'll get it. And Robert Hill said, what SIDS wants, Small Island Developing States are known as SIDS, what SIDS wants, SIDS gets. And of course, Robert Hill was absolutely right. And so John Podesta came on the commission. He didn't know really anything about oceans. He's never been involved in oceans issues. He came on the commission for 2 meetings in 6 months. He then left the commission. He went back to work for Obama in January 2014, and by June 2014 we had the Our Oceans event, which launched Obama's and Kerry's programme of creating marine reserves around all of the island. There was millions and millions of square kilometres of marine reserves around us.
Which was one of the last acts, really, of the Obama.
Well, they announced some in 2014, some in 2015, and then at the end of 2016 they announced further ones.
Brilliant. And when did the Commission fold, the Global Ocean Commission?
So the Commission released its first report in June 2014, and then we actually got additional funding because none of the commissioners wanted the report just to sit on the shelf.
No.
So we then got funding as a team, which was actually probably the more exciting part of the work, to take the Commission's report and proposals and to then campaign on them. Again, working with our commissioners at different events. And I should mention that, you know, our commissioners, we attended, I think, in the end, over 100 events with our commissioners, with them either speaking at events or attending panels or going to various meetings. We twice had meetings with Ban Ki-moon and various commissioners. But what we were able to do was to then campaign. So we were given an additional 1.5 years funding. What we did was to take each of the proposals and see if we could drive them forward. So, for instance, we had a campaign sort of around the SDG, which resulted in, you know, and again, other people campaigned on as well. We're not claiming the credit, but the Commission had a specific voice and a role to play on pushing for the SDG. The same for the new implementing agreement. We actually organised a meeting in Monaco in the autumn of 2014, and we set up this group called the Monaco Group. We brought in about 8 to 10 like-minded countries, because what you found is that there were a number of countries within the UN that wanted a new implementing agreement, but they didn't have the resources to coordinate their activities. So we helped do that. So we brought them together, had a meeting in Monaco, created the Monaco Group, and then actually worked with them to have an actual strategy on how to push for a new implementing agreement under UNCLOS. We also worked with the Institute of is it Foreign Relations in the US, and we organised a big workshop with them where we got senators to come and hear about why, you know, even though the US had never signed up to UNCLOS, why they shouldn't oppose a new implementing agreement and how it would be beneficial. We resurrected a group called the Friends of Fish at the WTO. It's a group within the WTO that had been kind of dormant for about 10 years. We resurrected the issue of perverse subsidies and the need to address subsidies through the WTO. Working, the big leader there was New Zealand, so we kind of reenacted that group. We did a lot of work with Ocean Conservancy and ISU on plastics to raise that issue. We tried to push for the new sort of Global Ocean Accountability Board, but we were quite successful on a number of areas. The other area where we pushed, it wasn't actually in our original proposals, but we created an initiative called Because the Ocean, and that pushed within the UNFCCC in order to get the IPCC to do a special chapter on oceans and to raise the profile of oceans within the UNFCCC discussions, and because the oceans had a massive signing where about 35 countries signed up to it on the eve of the UNFCCC meeting in Paris.
David Attenborough was present, wasn't he, or was that something else? It was.
I think
it
that
was
might
a
have
lot
been
of
something
ocean
else. We had a lot of. It was a good event.
Fantastic.
It was a good event. So we were able to, and then we came up with our final report called "The Future We Want" in February 2016, just before the Commission formally closed. And what that did was to again highlight what the Commission had called for, sort of record some of the works that we'd done over the last year and a half, and set out what we felt needed to be done going forward.
Thank you very much. And I mean, if you could sort of focus on, thank you, Simon, that was incredibly helpful, on 2 or 3 areas where you feel countries or regions are getting it right on the ocean. That I would welcome any particular case studies where you think a lot of success is happening. And then I suppose your vision for the future now, in light of having delivered that report and the GOC no longer being around, and if you could wave your magic wand, where would you sort of focus political attention and time and resources now?
So one of the bits of work we did was with Fiji and Peter Thompson, who at the time was the Fijian ambassador. He's now actually is he the chair of the General Assembly?
I think he is, yeah.
And he called us up in February 2015, saying that he'd read the report, the SDG was about to be signed, but he was concerned that although it was phenomenally great that we had an SDG on the ocean, the SDG on the ocean, or the ocean issues within the UN, were what he called the orphan issues. In other words, and it comes back to the initial problem that we said about oceans. He said the oceans issue has no one department that has overall responsibility. So the concern is that the SDG will never be delivered on. It's an orphan issue. It's got no mummy or daddy to look after it and guide it through. So he came up with the idea of triennial summits. And we worked with him to create, it's not yet a triennial summit, but the first ever UN Oceans and Seas Conference will be in June of this year. It was originally going to be in Fiji and now be in New York. It's a UN Conference on Oceans and Seas. It is led by Fiji and Peter Thompson. And the idea is that this conference will, where we thought it could really evolve, how we'd like to see it evolve, is it becomes the UNFCCC of the ocean. In other words, you start a process, you have a standalone event every year or every 2 years, or in this original proposal was every 3 years, and it measures progress. It sets a load of benchmarks, sets some scientific benchmarking, keeps going back to that benchmarking every 2 to 3 years, seeing whether we've improved or whether we've slipped further, and also monitoring some of the UN agencies and whether they're actually doing their job. So that first ever conference. So Fiji, and certainly a lot of the Pacific islands and the small island developing states, they are very progressive on ocean issues, simply because it is their livelihood, and they've seen their livelihood diminish and decline for many years. Yes, a lot of them are equally as concerned about the climate issue as well, because a lot of them are low-lying coastal countries or low-lying islands. But they're fighting on both fronts. They're fighting, one, to address climate change and sea level rise, but also to address the way in which we manage the ocean, so it is more sustainable for them in the longer term. So I would say that they're a very progressive group. The US has been phenomenal under Obama with the creation of marine reserves. It's really set off a sort of race almost, which has been fantastic. Chile has been a phenomenal partner. And again, a country that has a significant history with the ocean in terms of fishing and its resources, but is also recognising how important a healthy, sustainable ocean is going forward. And so not only their work on fisheries, but also their work on marine reserves and the Easter Island marine reserve, marine protected area that Chile I mean, it isn't Chile's because they've had to work very closely with the indigenous population. So it's a joint initiative.
Thank you.
Prince Albert of Monaco has obviously been a real champion in some of these areas, as has, importantly, Prince Charles in the UK. Other areas, other countries, South Africa, I think, is progressive in parts. I think the whole issue of... I still think there's an awful lot of work to be done in Africa with... Africa's got so many problems, but the issue of IUU fishing and how it impacts on countries who are finding it difficult just to manage and police their own EEZs without then... because you have to remember that the IUU fishing is carried out mainly by developed, wealthy nations.
Yes.
It's not carried out by poor, developing countries. They don't have the resources to subsidise other people's vessels to go halfway around the world. It is carried out by a relatively small group, sort of 15 or so, relatively wealthy countries who are able to, allow these things to happen. And so something like IUU, and I think this is an argument that's missing, is that some of our poorest developing countries are suffering the most as a result of some of the actions of our wealthiest.
It's highly unjust.
It's highly unjust.
And these 10 to 15 countries,
they're in the report. It's it is European countries.
Yeah.
It's Taiwanese. It's Japan. It's and there's a list of them.
Yeah. The Seychelles is also a good example where they've come up with some interesting financial models around.
I don't know the detail. I'll be honest with you.
The blue bond. So it's one I'm going to write about in the book. And then there's the question of the UK sort of areas in the overseas territories.
Yeah, and the UK again, has picked up that, and I would like to think going forward. I mean, I think the UK is very keen, despite the fact we are leaving Europe, to show that we are not building a wall around the UK, and we will be still a global leader. I think somewhere where the UK has history and it has form is on our overseas territories and our sort of, relationship to the marine environment. And so, if the UK can keep being very progressive in those areas, that would be great. Both on its overseas territories, but also, I think the UK could have a role to play in UNCLOS under the negotiation of a new implementing agreement. For instance, on provision for creating high seas marine reserves, which is the kind of prize, really, because there's a limit to how many marine reserves we can create within your exclusive economic zone, which is the decision of the country whose zone it is. What we could really do with, given that 70% of the planet is ocean, is some, and 45% of the planet is high seas. We need some high seas marine reserves, where countries agree, to set aside. Essentially, we have them on land, so there should be no reason why we can't have them on sea. And technology is making the policing of those, one, possible, and two, relatively cheap.
Because of satellite imagery.
Using satellite technology and VMS technology, all boats have to have transmitters. Satellites can see where they are, and using that technology would make it's becoming increasingly easier to be able to police a high seas marine reserve.
Backed up by a strong marine port authority.
Yeah, and backed up by strong international agreements.
And strong international agreements. And in the absence of the GOC, who now will follow the ocean? So there's some push for a sort of UN special rapporteur on the ocean.
Yeah, I mean, we called part of, I've just highlighted some of the key areas.
Sure.
We highlighted the new implementing agreement under UNCLOS as a piece of legislation, but what we also called for was a new Undersecretary General on the ocean. And basically, for nations to realise that, we've got to bump it up the ladder. It is such a significant part of the Earth's surface that we need to start looking after it. And I mean, another area is that, Sweden created their own ocean ambassador, and this is something that we think other countries should follow. In fact, I gave a presentation in May to The Norwegian Labour Party, who some people think might be back in power again, Jonas Gahr Store, in I think it's the autumn of this year, making exactly the same point, that their neighbours, those Swedes, are one step ahead of them on the oceans because they have an ocean ambassador. Of course, this went down very well because, what, the Swedes are ahead of us? That's outrageous.
That's very interesting. Well, it would be a great thing. So,
but yeah, we need. I think countries should have ocean ambassadors that are basically directly feeding into their environment departments, or even into their cabinets. I mean, it's about taking, in the same way that we have, in many countries, have taken climate change seriously and are actually enacting legislation on climate change, are appointing climate change czars and climate change ministers. I think we should be doing exactly the same on the ocean. And it's, I mean, do we need that? I mean, yes, we do. The ocean actually, it regulates our climate. It is the driver of climate on the planet. The climate change isn't what's affecting our climate. Climate change is actually warming the ocean. It's that that's affecting our climate. And I think people need to make that link, that it doesn't just, it's all part and parcel of the same process. And that's that great story. So I remember when we went to Cape Town a few years ago, there was that geoengineering idea that we should, in the Antarctic, you get this water that's very rich in nutrients, but it's lacking iron, so the nutrients cannot be accessed by the phytoplankton or zooplankton. You might need to check the science on this, but one of the scientists, when we went to Cape Town, pointed this out, that, of course there was that idea to put loads of iron filings in the Antarctic, so you get these algal blooms and sulfur carbon out of the atmosphere. Of course, far more simplistic, far too simplistic for the reality. He worked out that that is the very same water that then sinks, comes up off the west coast of Africa, accesses the iron from the land runoff, causes the algal blooms on the west coast of Africa, which then feed all the fish and then supplies everyone in Africa with their food. So if you create algal blooms in the Antarctic, it means that you're not going to have algal blooms off the west coast of Africa. So you may suck a few million tonnes of carbon out of the atmosphere, but you'll probably kill off half.
Terrible. Well, I hope that's permanently died a death, that idea.
But I think my point there is that science has come leaps and bounds, and what we're realising now is that, everything is a system. We're living in an era where science is showing us that, it's systems that we're working with. Now, I mean, for me, that shouldn't be rocket science. We worked out in the 70s that we need to manage our rivers as a system. Otherwise, what happens upstream is going to affect you downstream. And we looked at whole systems management. I.e., not only do we manage what goes into the river, but we manage what's in the catchment area at the top, so that we can all have clean water. And the reality is that the ocean is a giant circulatory system, and that we have to manage it as such. And simply kind of like dividing it up and going, well, it doesn't matter what we do over here because it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. I mean, and the simple fact that in the Marianas Trench they're finding PCBs and organophosphates shows you that what we do on land and also what we do over here has, basically goes everywhere.
Really interesting. Shipping is another big issue, isn't it? These global, huge supply chains built on shipping and how to make their environmental practice better and their footprint lighter and their emissions fewer.
Yeah, I mean, shipping has come a long way, I think. I mean, there's still, they still need to, I think it's MARPOL, isn't it, that covers the main areas for them. I mean, we're still having shipping company, there'll still be rogue people that dump their rubbish over the side, and there'll still be sort of, that flush out their tanks, etc., etc. I mean, the quality of fuel, I think, is a big problem with shipping. The elephant in the room with shipping, in my view, is the emissions associated with it.
Yes.
They're enormous because you're using very low quality fuel. Basically, bunker fuel, basically. But I also think the shipping industries could play a phenomenal role in actually providing us more science on the oceans. If all ships were required to carry certain devices, built into their hulls, measuring temperature and all sorts of other things, it would be really useful. And bringing the shipping companies on side with that would be, I think, really beneficial.
What's going to come to the ocean's rescue? Is it going to be kind of massive international campaigns a la Greenpeace of ours? Is it going to be a change in consumer behaviour, political will? José María Figueira is becoming Costa Rican president and cajoling another 20 heads of state. What if you could wave your magic wand, what would you do? What 3 things would you do to really put things on track?
Put things on track. I mean, so I actually think, I mean, I am optimistic because I think that the lessons that we have learned in relation to climate change, and you're still going to have your naysayers out there, but generally speaking, any leader that, most credible leaders, I'm being diplomatic.
Very diplomatic.
Credible leaders, I think, recognise that climate change is a major issue that we are dealing with and having to deal with, and it has phenomenal implications. But they're also recognising that, the systems approach that has shown us what climate change means can be easily applied to the way in which we treat our oceans. Now, the oceans aren't going to go away, but what we have to ask ourselves is that, what do we want our oceans to be? Do we want them to be sort of like dead zones with reduced species and full of waste, or do we want them to be healthy and vibrant? And I'm a great believer in that. You're hard to find anyone, I think, that hasn't got some affinity with going to a beach and looking out across the ocean. And I think realisation that we have to look after that. I mean, it has to be. I mean, even now, people going to the beach and seeing the amount of plastic, it's really upsetting. So, my magic wand is number one. I would like, leaders to. I think they already do recognise, but to basically set up that sort of accountability type board, set up a UNFCCC equivalent on the ocean. Policy decisions are made, are going to be made on science eventually. They're always made on science, and they're very practical ways in which we address things.
Yeah.
But we need to put that in place.
Yeah.
So it's all well and good having public campaigns. It'll come down eventually to, okay, what's the science? What's the science around the problem? And I think already there's enough information there. We don't actually have enough science on. We know, it's true what they say. We know sometimes more about the moon than we do about what happens in the deep ocean. So if there are the 3 things I'd like to see is I'd like to see a UNFCCC equivalent for oceans, an oceans sort of sustainability board that's monitoring progress. I would like to see investment in science of the oceans.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, yes, all of these things cost money, but, when you consider that our oceans are acidifying at a rate that I think some people haven't seen, for millions of years, and they are warming at a rate that people haven't seen for millions of years. In the same way that we recognise that's a major issue from a climate perspective, it's pretty simple to figure out that's a major issue from an ocean's perspective as well. That has significant implications for, and then you link back into that the fact that the oceans are a major source of food for billions of people, and it's a primary protein for billions of people. Then effective and efficient management of that resource is crucial.
Fantastic. Yeah, we've just got to get this right and fast. Are there any particular political champions other than the ones you mentioned who are there at the moment? Mr. Trudeau, perhaps?
I think Trudeau. I think I actually think countries like Japan could be phenomenal champions because, Japan recognise. I mean, Japan relies heavily on ocean resource. They don't want to see inefficient, ineffective mismanagement that basically undermines the role that ocean plays, both within their sort of culture, but within their daily lives. And I think countries like Japan could be encouraged to take leadership on this.
China too?
Potentially, potentially.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much, Simon. That's been a very helpful interview, and I really appreciate your time.
Pleasure.